I am very interested in folks that have a property or have an established experience and have been looking for ways to integrate live into an augmented reality world or vice versa. And that sounds kind of like, oh, Kyle, that's so easy, but you'd be surprised.
Nothing about that sounds easy. Happy Friday, everybody. I'm Brendan Bradley with the Fifth Wall Forum, committed to bringing together industry insiders from the theater and technology worlds to create opportunities for new kinds of virtual performance. And today I'm having a conversation with Kyle Wright, principal at Broadway Tech Accelerator and director of digital projects at the Schubert Organization. Today's conversation is brought to you by the Fifth Wall Forum Discord channel, a robust community of hundreds of technologists and artists sharing job postings, tutorials, upcoming performances, and the home of Artifact Friday, where our mentors and collaborators share artifacts from their work, giving Fifth Wall Forum members a first glimpse at the latest in innovation in immersive storytelling. Find out more at our website at fifthwallforum.com. That's 5THWALLFORUM.com. And now let's get to the conversation. Welcome, Kyle.
Hi there. How are you?
I'm good. It's good to hear your voice. I've been talking to you over different types of devices for over a year now as part of the Fifth Wall Forum.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much.
One of the very first conversations that you and I ever had was about how you miss hosting your Canasta game. And I grew up in a multi-generational household where my grandparents aggressively taught me Canasta and Casino. Where did you pick up the game?
Well, I actually grew up playing with my parents as well. So they would have these giant card parties, and we would all have our friends over, and my parents' friends would bring their kids, and then the kids would hang out in the basement. And then eventually, when I was like 8, I got sick of playing Nintendo downstairs, and it's like, I want to play cards. And so they said, okay, fine. And I came up and started playing. But it was always kind of an interesting way for my parents, and I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, to have a lot of their friends over who worked in different fields or came from different backgrounds. And it ended up being, apart from a highly competitive card game where people sometimes stop talking to each other for weeks, a nice way to meet people and a way to actually facilitate conversation without it being forced or awkward or necessarily drinking too much, although sometimes that happened as well. And so when I moved here to New York, I was kind of craving that level of community and way of having, organic networking and ways of bringing people together in a way that everyone's comfortable with. And so my husband and I started this Canasta game, and because I work for a company that owns the building Sardi's is located in, we're very close with Sardi's, and started having it on the 4th floor. And before you knew it, we had like 60 people showing up, the first Friday of every month, and that ranged from people in venture capital to performance to directing to producing to people in finance. And the only rule we had and still have once we go back to it is no business, no autographs, which means, of course, there's tons of business and there might be autographs, right, but not officially. And so it became a really nice place to have a community of people just to talk and get to know each other and meet each other on a level playing field, which is what I really enjoy, and was kind of a concept that I've carried into a lot of what I do in business development and project development, is finding ways to organically introduce people in situations and environments where they feel comfortable and can be creative. And I found that that's a really great place to start. And almost any endeavor is making sure that you get the brightest minds in the room and the coolest people you can find, and find a way to get them to know each other. And then good things typically tend to happen, which is how you and I kind of met, actually.
I would agree that that's exactly the culture and spirit that you brought to the Fifth Wall Forum, a real sense of real connection and play, even amidst the kind of business and troubleshooting of trying to figure out how to navigate these new mediums. Have you always just had a real good sense of connection and play, or is it something you work on or have learned from or built as you've grown your career?
That's a very kind way of putting it, Brendan. I like to think I was actually the curmudgeonly producer person that had to say no more often than not, but fine. You could call it a sense of play if you want. Sure. I think, I grew up performing, as did you. I started performing professionally when I was 11 and in regional theater. Wichita, a music theater of Wichita, and then a couple other places, in and around the Midwest. And basically grew up working in almost every capacity of theater, whether it was in set painting or costume design or carpentry or stage management. And it's hard to grow up from 11 on in the summers and sometimes even during the school year working with theater professionals and not cultivate a great sense of play. Otherwise, you'll want to throw yourself off a cliff. So that's part of it. And then, when you kind of merge that with the crazy people I've met working in the innovation and technology space, it just it's kind of a play or die situation. So not to make it overly morbid. So I guess, yeah. And I've always loved the idea of throwing things against a wall and hoping it doesn't go through the wall. If it sticks, you're in a good place. And that's just kind of how I've cultivated my career here at Schubert, which has been wonderful because although people know us for being venue owners and theater producers in a very traditional way, I have a lot of leeway to explore and make use of the connections that we have and the position that we have to pave the way for people to do interesting things. Now, that might always not end up on Broadway, just like we, startup companies have a very low hit rate, so do really creative ideas. But when you get one that hits, it really hits and it can be transformational. And so for me, taking risk, which is part of playing, is a big piece of that. And I hope I never lose that, regardless of how many failures I might have. So there you go. And that, I don't know if that answers your question, but there's my answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think speaking of kind of that startup culture and that taking risks, the Broadway Tech Accelerator is, for lack of a better word, an accelerator for early stage startups in live entertainment. Long before COVID. And given the last year's kind of sobering reaction to the need for scalable technical solutions on Broadway, what has changed in the past year at the Accelerator and what hasn't?
Well, accelerators are interesting. We got into that business mostly because you have to go back about 10 years, and I've been at this company for 10 years, which is just insane. And when I moved to New York, I started working for a startup company that connected buyers with sellers. Essentially, it was a marketplace concept early on in the days of Groupon, and really focused on, even pre-Groupon actually, focused on connecting employees at large companies with discount tickets to Broadway shows. It provided a value for the company because it was always delivered through the HR department, and it provided a value to the show because it was a veiled discount channel. And that got bought by Schubert Organization 10 years ago, and I moved over and started managing our email marketing. And what ended up happening, and I realize this is a very circuitous way to answer your question, but I promise we'll get there, is that we at Schubert own the venue and we own the ticketing system, and we oftentimes produce shows in some capacity. So we own all the data, but we only own the data on people who buy a ticket. And this is a pebble in the shoe of most venue owners and most producers, in that we have very strong relationships with individuals who buy the tickets, but not necessarily with everyone who sits in the seats, to the tune of we only know 1 out of every 3 people sitting in our seats typically, and that was around 2011.
Oh.
And what we ended up doing is saying, well, that's crazy, because we want to market to these people and there's an inherent marketing value to this information. We should be doing our best to establish relationships with as many of the people who are sitting in our seats as we can. And so that led to working with a lot of different startup companies or new products at established companies, and creating pilot programs in kind of an ad hoc basis within our theaters, within our ticketing systems, providing access to shows, to marketing information, to data. And we worked with about 15 different companies in that capacity over the course of 4 or 5 years. That ranged from food and beverage applications to this creepy company that I won't name that took these giant high-res pictures of entire audiences, and you could zoom in and do facial recognition on them. Wow. So that was creepy. That no longer exists for many reasons, I think. But we tried a lot of different stuff, and some of it worked, some of it didn't. I'd say we had about a 30% hit rate, which is pretty good. And what we realized about 5 years into that process was that we were doing a couple things. Well, we're doing a lot wrong, but we're doing a couple things very wrong. Number one, the only way to work with us was to either know me or know my boss or know our CEO, and be able to say, hey, I want to try this thing. And then it would bubble down usually to me, which is fine, except we found that all the founders we were working with,
they all played Canasta on the 4th floor?
Yeah, none of them did. This is pre-Canasta. This is PC. And so we were like, well, that's not cool, for many reasons that are obvious, and some that were less obvious, right. Which is we're just not getting a wide enough range of ideas by not having a centralized place that people can apply to. And the second thing, which became very clear, is that by doing it in an ad hoc way, we were typically saying we'll do a pilot program and lock in a low rate for this product if we want to use it. And in my early days of this, I didn't understand the value of what we were doing and the power that we had as a first client. And there were some companies that I actually put out of business by making them go too low with their pricing, which is not the point.
Right.
So we decided, hey, you know what? People are doing this accelerator thing. That's exactly what I said to my board. And I said, we should do it too. And we went on a little bit of a wild ride, creating a fully, funded Accelerator for its boutique for only 4 companies per cohort, 2 cohorts per year. We took a percentage of equity into the 13-week curriculum and introduced them to a lot of the key players in the live entertainment space. And we were heavily focused on, at the time, only technology companies that had at least a core vertical in live entertainment, focused even further in on theater if we could. And that was all fine. And we were applying the kind of rigor that you see at 500 Startups or Techstars. And the issue with that we quickly grasped, we had a couple of pretty big successes. One, True Tickets. I'm actually going tonight at Tanglewood. They're doing who they've brought on as a client or a pilot client. They're forwarding 9,000 tickets in the blockchain, and they use the IBM distributed ledger to actually control ticket passage. And they're obviously appending health information and all this kind of stuff for entry, which is great for 9,000 people at one concert. So I'm going to go see that tonight, and they were our first cohort. But what we've realized and where this has augmented, to answer your question, in the last year is early on, we were trying to only work with companies that we thought at the time would be and I'm using big air quotes here, the Uber of whatever. That's not necessarily what everyone wants to be these days. And because of that, I think we turned away some really interesting businesses that we didn't think could be tens of $1 million, $100 million businesses, but could have been nice, healthy, mid-sized businesses that would be transformational in our own way in our industry. And so a lot of what we've done the last year, mostly because we don't have a lot of funding, because we've had no revenue, because there is no theater, has been investing in programs that really help connect people, help seed new businesses, and working with businesses that we think are going to be healthy businesses, profitable businesses that will actually facilitate a long-term strategic change in the way we think about how we tell stories on stage. And I think it's pretty liberating, because it's really hard to come up with an idea that is going to be, a giant billion-dollar business in a very boutique industry that has a very outsized impact. We like to say a lot that Broadway, and I'd say this is true of most live entertainment and immersive entertainment, is the smallest business with the largest shadow, because we have a huge outsized impact on arts and culture, on the way people view the world. I'm not talking about Broadway here exclusively, just in general and what we do as storytellers. But when you look at the dollars and cents, it's not a big business compared to like Amazon, obviously. Right. But we have a huge cultural impact, and with that comes a great responsibility. And so that's a lot of what we're thinking about is how can we use the resources, not just money, and probably least of all money, although that's important, at our disposal as Schubert, as Broadway, as storytellers, to really think about how we can pave the way for smart people to take the risks they need to take and have the failures they're going to have to push us in a direction for scaled growth into different types of storytelling that really focus on accessibility of story, different experiences, immersive, XR, the metaverse. All these things I think are important. Not all of them will have a place for the majority of people, but there are aspects of all of these technologies and methods of storytelling that I think can favorably impact the way that we work and exist in the world.
That was amazing. I can't believe you just kind of like pulled all that out. I feel like
Don't ask me to repeat it. Thank God you're recording. Yeah, right.
It sounds like you've been thoughtfully kind of circling what is become more a reckoning during the last year of a conversation about who gets to tell stories and who gets to watch stories, an overdue conversation about representation. Where can we do more in our industry? And what have you found as kind of like best steps to inviting more people to the picnic?
That's a great question, and thank you for that question. I don't know that I am the person who can give you the best answer to that. What I can tell you is I can only look at my own company and my own experience here, right? And my own industry. There seem to be, and I think we're all feeling our way through this, and some successfully, some this will never be a thing we say, well, that's finished. Obviously, right. It will never be finished. Right. The work is always ongoing. But I think there's 2 paths that are both crucial and are both seem to be taking place. The initial path of how do we make change now? How do we I don't want to say put points on the board, but how do we actually facilitate a real meaningful today it was like this, tomorrow it's like this. And I think things that are happening in that space are happening at my own company. At the board level, we've kind of mixed up our board makeup. We've added an entirely new division that's focused on how we think about equity, diversity, and inclusion across our entire business, from just the way we operate as a business to the way we think about cultivating artists. We have something called the Artist Circle that launched about 4 months ago, aimed at kind of building up the next generation of up-and-coming producers with a focus specifically on equity, diversity, and inclusion around BIPOC groups that want to innovate and create specifically in this space. And I think that's very important. Where I think my brain is best applied and what I'm trying to think about is how we create the pipelines and the sandboxes and the environments that are easily scaled, that are solid structurally and from an infrastructure standpoint, and that we can really build a tent around and continue to expand that tent. Because I think there's only a certain number of people that are ready to, when it comes to Broadway, ready to kind of go into Broadway, right? But there's a huge piece of what we're working on in the immersive space and in different types of storytelling where it's so exciting in a way for people to cut their teeth and try and fail. And so what I'm trying to do is, in as many places I can, build as many opportunities for a variety of people, for everybody who wants to give it a shot, to get in there and understand and learn about our business. Because I think one of the biggest things that's apparent to me is I know about this business because I played Oliver when I was 11, and not everyone gets that opportunity, right? And I think the more we can do to create those opportunities for people to really understand what it means to work in this business and how many different exciting opportunities there are, I think the better we are going to be in 5, 10, 15 years, because we will have encouraged an entire crop of brilliant people, forget their background, just brilliant people, to be in our space. And I think that's what we need. We need the passion and we need the brilliance that has made this business in theater and more broadly in entertainment what it is, because you need those storytellers, and those are hard to find. And I think it just makes sense in general from a logical standpoint. Why would you hamstring yourself by only, opening up your doors, even the hallway to get to the door, to people who are privileged enough to be able to explore that just because of who they are? We should be really attempting to broaden that hallway and make the door bigger and make the tent bigger, if that makes sense. I think I overused that analogy, but there you go.
Absolutely. No, I really appreciate the real laser focus on how to communicate and convert, this very specific skill set and context of how you intend the future of this particular corner of the industry. I think in the Fifth Wall Forum, you and I, in a lot of ways, I learned so much, that kind of education you're describing of just like showing up to what the expectations are for this particular model and angle. The idea of, we'd get on calls with different artists or institutions or some of our prototypes from our reveal teams, where there's the ideas that are scalable from a commercial model, and then there's the ideas that are just the abstract, it's really cool academically what you're exploring, and there's space for both. But when it comes to how do you scale a commercial product and bring it to market, that is such a different journey as an artist, as a producer, for the IP, which I just think is such a remarkably different way of looking at it than I think most people do. Is there kind of a best kept secret, or the thing that you think most people don't know about the more commercial location-based side of what we know as the Broadway?
Yeah, I mean, look, the truth is, and here are all my disclaimers, I don't speak on behalf of the industry at large, as you know. I'm very involved, but that's why we have the Broadway League and all that piece when it comes to any of these conversations. But what I would say, and what I know you and I talked a lot about relative to the Fifth Wall Forum, is there's several, I think, misconceptions around what it means to be commercially viable in the entertainment space. Number one, we all think about the Wickeds of the world and the Phantom of the Operas and the Hamiltons of the world and Lion Kings, which are all wonderful shows, and they've existed for a long time and will continue to this for a long time because they're great. Chicago, all these guys, right? But the truth is, you don't have to run for 35 years to make money. And I actually believe above that in the ephemerality of theater. And I think even on Broadway, most shows are limited 18, 24-week runs, right? They are limited by design, and they are profitable in many cases. So it's not about making something that can run forever or has to run forever to be profitable. It's about identifying what the audience is, what the market is, and what you're trying to the story you're trying to tell, and say, okay, is this something that should be around forever, or is this something that really is a time and a place and a moment? And how do we make sure that people can get to that moment? And I think then access that later if they can't be in person. I think that is important. And that could be passive income later. And then how do we make a business around that? How do we look at the unit economics? How do we make sure in a very simple way, per person, what we're spending is less than what we're making? And you can do that. You just have to do that math and think very strategically. And I think that is what's wonderful about this business, is that is a real left brain, right brain combination that God help you if you have both sides of it and are good at both sides, because you'll be an insane person very quickly. But I think that's why these teams are so important, in finding your match and your equal in the business side, if you're an artist, and vice versa. And you don't have to be wholly one thing or another, but I think trying to do it alone is part of why it's so difficult to do something different, right? Because when you're trying something completely out there, you're really immersed in the idea of how do I create this cool experience and blah, blah, blah. And it's hard to do that and think about, and how do I make sure I think about my audience and who my audience is, right? How do I actually put a business plan together? And so I think the collaborative nature of creating these projects manifests itself in the need for both art and business. And I think that's kind of what we try to do. And I think we did that somewhat successfully. I think, we could do better. But I think in creating these teams at Fifth Wall Forum, we really thought through this idea of how do we match people with different skill sets together who wouldn't necessarily find each other, knowing that that is the key to a successful project in the space.
Absolutely. You brought up the business of all of this, and I know there's still a lot of anxiety about the return of Broadway in the middle of continued surges and breakthrough cases, but I know Broadway also has a role to play in getting us back to normal. I'll never forget my first week in New York was 9/11, and I walked those empty streets of Times Square, but it was free performances on Broadway that got me to kind of re-enter after that experience. And as someone who knows kind of the inside baseball of one or two theaters in Times Square, what makes you optimistic about our reentry?
Look, I think we have unbelievable people working for and with us. We have the commitment of our actors and our stagehands and our ushers, and we have people that are just as passionate about getting back to the performance and running of Broadway as people who want to buy tickets. And I think that symbiosis is why it's going to be great. And, we already have shows running. Schubert does not, but we have shows on Broadway running. Passover just launched and Springsteen. Our first show is opening on September 14th. We even had this earlier week a film premiere, which was really exciting, about a documentary called The Show Must Go On, which I recommend people take a look at. Actually, I think it's on Netflix, I believe. I forget where it's launching, but you can look it up. It is about the South Korean Broadway tours that actually performed and rehearsed during the height of the pandemic because South Korea had such a good handle on what was going on. But they had this footage that you're talking about, like of these empty streets. And I got to tell you, it gave me like weird chills. It was like I was watching some weird futuristic movie. I'm like, I do remember what this was like. So, we are first and foremost focused on how we communicate with our patrons about the safety of coming, the security of having flexibility with their tickets. It's really, as it always should be, but it is and always is, it's really heightened now. And it's more about how we make our audiences comfortable and secure and safe than it is about the creation of the content that they're coming to see, because so many of these shows have already existed. Now they're rehearsing and they're polishing. It's going to be great. We have new plays opening, and that's important. But for the first time in a long time, the customer experience and the feeling of the patron is taking a really big part of this relaunch, as it should. And that's been really lovely to see, I think, because a lot of very productive conversations that have been had for years and continue to be having are really having some traction that are great around how we make sure that when people enter and really thinking about what's common in the immersive space, this idea of onboarding, right? How do we think about what it means to onboard a patron into a Broadway theater, especially coming back from a pandemic? And that a lot of thought and care has been put into that and will continue to be put into that with leadership from the Broadway League kind of really guiding everybody and the venue owners. It's been a really collaborative effort, which is why I have a lot of confidence that we're going to be up and running in September and going to the fall, and we're going to be flexible and all that. But I think it's all signs are pointing towards that's happening, and we're moving forward, which is great.
Well, I am so excited because I cannot wait to return to the theater myself.
Well, we can't wait to have you.
Bringing it back to the Fifth Wall Forum, you and the rest of the team helped shepherd 9 actual prototypes for live storytelling using groundbreaking extended reality technologies. And while I know we're all Zoom fatigued, there's so much potential and cool new ways to tell compelling stories. And I was curious if there was a specific show that really surprised you during the shutdown, or a style or medium of virtual performance that you've now fallen in love with.
That's a great question. I think, and this just speaks to my kind of background, right? So there was a production called Hamlet Noir that I thought was really interesting when they first started putting it together. And it's a combination of an immersive experience and an in-person experience. And what I liked about what they were doing early on, and I haven't kept up with where they are now in terms of like, because these things always morph, but there was this idea of right? There was a VR component, there was an in-person component, there was a mixed and it was all built, which I like. You can hear this reoccurring concept, this idea from a business standpoint of you have this story and you keep adding to the world, right? You keep building around it, and they're not mutually exclusive, they're not cannibalizing each other. It's an and scenario. Mm-hmm. And that we saw with several other groups as well. And what excites me personally about that is that concept of and is something that I see could happen and may be happening, and I can't talk about it, in and around Broadway, where we think about these really rich worlds that we have, right? Whether it's Music Man or Wicked or Dear Evan Hansen or Come From Away or Phantom of the Opera or whatever it's going to be. We have these really rich worlds in which we're looking at just one piece of the story in a proscenium. So I love this concept that you can build additional aspects and give people more experience and more immersion in character and story and world without eclipsing or cannibalizing the existing property. And that really gets me excited. And what gets me more excited is that some of the people who participated kind of heard that concept, which has been around for a long time, this idea of world building, and got really excited. I could see their eyes light up. And we'll see where those seeds bear fruit. But I think we will see that and are seeing that in certain producers that I know that are working on things that I never thought they would have worked on. And I can't tell you, so don't ask me. But it's going to be, there's some really cool things happening that are merging this idea of very successful commercial producing with this idea of immersive world building and story in a way that I think will be delightful for audiences and I think transformational for what we do.
Well, I'm excited to know when we know. Speaking of what you can talk about, part of the point of this podcast is to kind of give a megaphone to wherever you are. If there's something you're currently struggling to find, whether it's a resource or certain types of talent, we just want to kind of shout it out to the community. Hey, can anybody help?
Well, that's a really great question. We are, Stephanie Riggs, who I know you've had on or will have on, and Rob Outen and I are launching a new venture, and we're launching it in a couple of weeks, actually, at the Immersive Homecoming. But what we're working on in there is this idea of how we integrate augmented reality assets with live performance. And we're pretty far along and have an interesting prototype. I won't tell you too much about it because we're launching it in a couple of weeks. But what I'll tell you is we are, and I am, very interested in folks that have a property or have an established experience and have been looking for ways to integrate live into an augmented reality world or vice versa. And that sounds kind of like, oh, Kyle, that's so easy, but you'd be surprised. And because what we're trying to do is make this idea.
Nothing about that sounds easy.
Well, we make it look easy. How about that? And what we're trying to accomplish is this idea of a theater in a box, right? So that you anywhere can become a theater if you have a phone, a tablet, glasses, whatever it's going to be, and a space, whatever size that is, and a performer for many reasons. Obviously, we started talking about this in terms of when we needed to be outside all the time, and that grew into, well, this could have applications everywhere. And so anybody that's looking to create something that will have an audience and has been intrigued by this idea of how do I call it the bobbing along on the beautiful briny sea concept, which for those, bed knobs and broomsticks is, they're dancing around in the water, and this idea of like the animated world with the actual live action world. Anybody who's trying to create something like that in IRL in real life, we want to talk to you because I think there's some real interesting applications there. And you call me or Stephanie or Rob, but we're really trying to get out there and kick the tires on this thing and start to scale it up into real pilots and into real applications. So call me if you got ideas, or call Stephanie or call Rob. But that's my ask right now.
And speaking of how people call you, or maybe not call you directly, but how they get in touch with you, where can people go to get more information about you or about what you're working on?
Yeah, I think the best way to get a hold of me probably is going to be on LinkedIn. So you can search for me. It's just my name, Kyle Wright, on LinkedIn, and I work for the Schubert organization. Or if you have an idea for the Broadway Tech Accelerator, is another way to get to us and give us some of your ideas and thoughts and feedback.
Kyle, it is always such a pleasure to chat with you every week at the Fifth Wall Forum, but to get to talk to you one-on-one was a real treat. So thanks so much for your time.
Likewise, and thanks so much.
Thanks so much to Kyle Wright for the conversation. If you want to join me on the show, find me online at the handle Brendan A. Bradley or go to fifthwallforum.com to find out more. I'm Brendan Bradley, wishing you a happy Friday, and I'll see you next time.